Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. In this IFR ground lesson, we're going to talk about everybody's favorite topic, regulations, specifically regulations for instrument flying. As always, if you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video, share with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Just like with VFR flying, you're free to ignore any and all regulations when flying IFR in Flight Simulator. But if you want to fly IFR with any degree of realism, you likely want to have a working knowledge of instrument flight rules and regulations. And it's very important to know at least the basics if you want to fly IFR on a virtual ATC service like VATSIM. It's worth noting that most of the regulations that apply to VFR operators also apply to IFR operators. So if you'd like to review the basic VFR regulations, I'll leave a link to that video in this video's description. This video also makes the assumption that you're already familiar with the basics of instrument departures, en route flying, arrivals, and instrument approaches. If you're not already familiar with those topics, it's a good idea to check out those videos before watching this one. I'll leave a link to those videos along with a link to the entire instrument flying playlist in this video's description. As with the video on VFR regulations, this video will cover the regulations as they exist in the United States and its territories. Most other countries do have similar regulations, but there can be subtle differences in instrument flight rules from country to country. So if you're not flying in the US, make sure to try to seek out some information about the regs in the country you're flying in. Like VFR flying, IFR flying is governed by the Federal Aviation Regulations, or FARs, more formally known as Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR 14. Most of the rules for IFR flying are covered in Part 91 of the FARs, which covers general operating and flight rules, though things like the requirements for getting your instrument rating and maintaining your instrument currency are covered in Part 61, certification of pilots, flight instructors, and ground instructors. If you dig into the regs pretty deep, you'll also see that Part 95 covers IFR altitudes, but this has more to do with how things like minimum en route altitudes or MEAs are set than rules that pilots need to follow. Likewise, Part 97 covers standard instrument procedures, but this has more to do with the design and certification of instrument approaches than anything a pilot needs to know. If you're having a sleepless night despite watching this video and you want to dig into the full language of the regulations in all their glory, they can be found at ecfr.gov. Just look up Title 14, Chapter 1, and you can dig up all of the legalese of the Federal Aviation Regulations your heart desires. First, let's talk about what's in Part 61. It governs certification of pilots and instructors and adding additional ratings like an instrument rating, but it also governs flight currency. We'll talk more about the requirements for getting an instrument rating when we do our instrument check ride video. So let's take a look at what Part 61 has to say about maintaining your instrument currency once you're rated. Just like getting landings to stay current for VFR flying, which also applies to IFR flying, you have to do some instrument flying to stay current to fly IFR. This is covered in FAR 6157 paragraph C3. It states that in order to act as the pilot in command of a flight under IFR, within the last 6 months, the pilot needs to have flown 6 instrument approaches, holding procedures and tasks, and the intercepting and tracking of courses through the use of navigational electronic systems. These tasks can be accomplished in actual instrument conditions using a view-limiting device like Foggles with a safety pilot, or in an approved flight simulator or training device, which, no, does not include Microsoft Flight Simulator or X-Plane. If 6 months elapse without getting the requirements logged, you still have a grace period of another 6 months to log those requirements to reestablish your currency. But you can't operate as PIC under IFR until you do so, which means you can't do the approaches in actual instrument conditions without an instructor. If another 6 months go by without you getting the required flying, you'll have to do an instrument proficiency check, or IPC, to get back to being instrument current again. This is basically like a mini instrument check ride, except that it can be conducted by a flight instructor as well as a designated pilot examiner, or DPE, or an FAA inspector. As we get into the IFR operational regulations and Part 91, I want to emphasize some of the VFR rules that are important to remember when flying IFR. First, 91.113b says, when weather conditions permit, regardless of whether an operation is conducted under IFR or VFR rules, vigilance shall be maintained by each person operating an aircraft so as to see and avoid other aircraft. So even if you're operating under IFR, you're not relieved of the responsibility of seeing and avoiding other aircraft when you're not in the clouds. And if ATC does point traffic out to you and you are in the clouds, just advise them that you're in instrument meteorological conditions, or IMC. Second, the most important regulation in the FARs, 91.3, still applies to IFR flight. It states that the pilot in command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and is the final authority as to the operation of that aircraft. And in an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any rule in this part to the extent required to meet that emergency. So remember that the PIC is still the final authority on their aircraft, and in the event of emergency, you can toss out the rule book to the extent necessary to meet that emergency. Now let's dive into Part 91. First, let's take a look at what equipment we need in our aircraft to fly under instrument flight rules. This is governed by FAR 91.205. We know from the VFR portion of that regulation that all aircraft need an airspeed indicator, altimeter, and a magnetic direction indicator, which usually is a compass, as well as instruments that show engine power, engine health, and fuel quantity. So the first thing it says in the IFR equipment portion of that regulation is that we still have to have all of that stuff. Paragraph D covers what we need for IFR flight and says that in addition to the instruments and equipment we need for VFR flight, for IFR we need a gyroscopic rate of turn indicator and slip skid indicator. In most aircraft, this is combined into a turn coordinator with an inclinometer or ball. We need a sensitive altimeter that's adjustable for barometric pressure. This means an altimeter that has the big numbered marks in hundreds of feet and the little marks in increments of 20 feet instead of the really old-fashioned ones that have the big marks in thousands of feet. It also needs to have a way to adjust the altimeter to the current altimeter setting, which many of the old-fashioned ones don't have. We need a gyroscopic pitch and bank indicator, also known as an attitude indicator or artificial horizon. We need a gyroscopic direction indicator, so a heading indicator or HSI. And we need a clock that can display hours, minutes, and seconds with either a sweeping second hand or a digital seconds presentation. You'll notice that there is no requirement in the reg for a vertical speed indicator, so that's technically not required for IFR flight, though most IFR equipped aircraft are going to have one, and it certainly does make instrument flying a lot easier. The regs also say that you need two-way radio communications equipment and navigation equipment suitable to the route to be flown, as well as a generator or alternator of adequate capacity to power all of that stuff. In addition, if you have an aircraft that's capable of flying at or above flight level 240, you'll need either DME or an RNAV system to utilize those altitudes, and you still need things like a Mode C transponder and ADS-B out for certain types of airspace. In addition, some aircraft aren't approved for IFR operations regardless of the type of equipment that's on board, and this is usually set by the manufacturer. You can check the limitation section in the POH to see what types of operation the aircraft is approved for. If you don't see day and night operations listed in there, then the aircraft is not approved for instrument flight. Some of the aircraft that fall into this category in Flight Sim are the Cub Crafters X Cub and NX Cub. the Diamond DV20 in the Deluxe Edition, and the Pipistrelle Virus 121 in the Premium Deluxe Edition. There are also certain avionics suites that aren't approved for IFR operations or require additional equipment to be used under IFR. These include systems like the Garmin G3X and the Garmin G3X Touch that require an additional IFR certified GPS navigator to be used for IFR flight. Of course, in the flight sim, you can ignore the certification requirements and take any aircraft in the clouds, though I wouldn't recommend doing so without at least an attitude indicator on board. Just realize that with some aircraft, this is not realistic. IFR aircraft also have several inspections or checks they have to go through to be legal for IFR flight. All aircraft, regardless of whether they're certified for IFR and or VFR flight, have to go through an annual inspection every 12 calendar months and an ELT inspection if they require an ELT every 12 calendar months. IFR aircraft additionally also have to go through an altimeter inspection every 24 calendar months and a static system inspection every 24 calendar months. Any aircraft that's going to fly in airspace that requires a transponder inspection has to get a transponder inspection every 24 calendar months. And if the aircraft is equipped with VORs and would be flown IFR, it has to undergo a VOR receiver check every 30 days, though this may be performed by the pilot. Unfortunately, most of the ground testing methods for checking your VOR, such as ground testing stations called VOTs, and ground checkpoints are not emulated in Flight Simulator. You can do a dual VOR check. This check can be done on the ground or in the air. To perform this check, center the CDI of both VORs with a 2 indication. Note the bearing to the station of each indicator. The max permissible variation between the two indicators is plus or minus 4 degrees. You can also do a check called an airborne check. To perform this check, select a prominent ground reference point that lies along the center of an airway. Dial your VOR OBS to the radial for that airway and fly over that prominent reference point. Note your CDI displacement when over the reference point. The max indicated bearing or radial displacement error is plus or minus 6 degrees. Just be aware that VOR radials do seem to be off by a few degrees in Flight Sim, but they still should be within normal tolerances for these VOR checks if you want to practice them in Flight Simulator. You also need to test your instruments prior to each instrument flight to make sure everything is operational prior to departing. As you taxi out, look to make sure your airspeed is reading 0, your attitude indicator is level and that the airplane symbol is appropriately adjusted, that your heading indicator is aligned with your compass heading, and that your VSI reads 0. Make sure that your altimeter is set to the local altimeter setting and that it reads within 75 feet of the field elevation. You'll want to do a couple of little turns as you taxi out and make sure that your turn coordinator turns in the direction of the turn and that the ball moves to the outside of the turn and that your heading indicator moves appropriately but that your attitude indicator remains level. Also check any instruments that have inoperative flags to make sure those flags are not displayed. Check any annunciators very carefully and check both your electrical system and your vacuum system if so equipped. Of course, depending on the aircraft you're flying in Flight Simulator, it's unlikely that you'll find anything wrong, but all these tests should work appropriately in Flight Sim if you'd like to do them for realism or proficiency. Moving on to rules governing actual flight under IFR, FAR 91-167 tells you how much fuel you need when you fly IFR. It states that you need enough fuel to fly to the first airport of intended landing, fly from that airport to the alternate airport if an alternate is required, and then fly for 45 minutes after that at normal cruising speed. So when do we need or not need an alternate? Paragraph B of this regulation tells us that, and we call it the 1-2-3 rule. We do not need an alternate if from 1 hour before to 1 hour after our scheduled ETA at our destination, the weather reports or forecast indicate that the ceiling will be at least 2,000 feet above the airport's elevation and the visibility will be at least 3 statute mile. If the weather reports or forecast indicate that it will be less than that, we'll need to file an alternate. So what kind of weather do we need to file an airport as an alternate? That's covered in 91-169 paragraph C. It says to file an airport as an alternate, the weather reports or forecast must indicate that at the time of our arrival at the alternate, the weather will be at least a ceiling of 600 feet and a visibility of 2 statute miles if the airport has a precision approach, such as an ILS, a ceiling of at least 800 feet and a visibility of 2 statute miles if the airport only has a non-precision approach, such as a VOR or RNAV GPS approach. You can also file an airport that has no instrument approach as an alternate. To do this, the ceiling and visibility must be forecast or reported high enough that they will allow a descent from the MEA, an approach, and landing in basic VFR conditions. Also remember that you need to check one of the approach plates for the airport you want to file as an alternate. If it has the A symbol on the approach plate in the approach notes section, the airport has non-standard minimums for filing the airport as an alternate, and you need to look those up. If it has the A symbol with the NA beside it, that approach cannot be used to file the airport as an alternate. And if all approaches are so marked, you cannot file that airport as an alternate. It's also important to note that if you actually end up having to divert, you're not bound to your filed alternate. In fact, ATC may not even know what your filed alternate is. If a diversion occurs, you must use your judgment as PIC to select the airport that's the safest option for yourself and your passengers given the circumstances. FAR 91-173 states that to fly IFR in controlled airspace, you always need to file an IFR flight plan and receive an ATC clearance. You can't just take off in IFR conditions in the real world without doing these things, though you can take off out of uncontrolled airports if you can maintain VFR and pick up your IFR clearance airborne. When you get your IFR clearance, you will typically get 5 pieces of information that you can remember with the acronym CRAFT. Clearance limit, which is typically your destination, routing, including any SID you're assigned, altitude, frequency for departure, and transponder code. One thing you'll never hear when flying on an IFR flight plan in real life is cleared into the Class Bravo airspace. That's because if your filed route or ATC instructions take you into any kind of normal use airspace, even those with special clearance requirements, the IFR clearance that you received before you departed or the ATC instructions you received en route automatically give you clearance into that airspace if the route or instructions take you through it. The same is not true of any active special use airspace such as military operations areas or restricted areas. In real life, ATC will generally keep you clear of these areas, but you should still do your due diligence to plan or navigate around, under, or over active special use airspace. 91-175 talks about the rules for taking off and landing under IFR. The takeoff regs are covered in the bottom half of the reg in paragraph F, but it states at the beginning of that paragraph that this reg only applies to Part 121 operators, which are airlines, Part 125 operators, which are operators of a large aircraft, defined as aircraft having 20 or more seats, Part 129 operators, which are foreign airlines, and Part 135 operators, which are charter operators. For those operators, the standard IFR takeoff minimums are 1 statute mile visibility for aircraft with 2 engines or less, and 1/2 statute mile visibility for aircraft with more than 2 engines, with no required ceiling minimums. It's important to note that most of these operators have authorization in their operation specifications for taking off in much lower visibilities than the standard takeoff minimums. Part 91 or general aviation operators are not bound by any takeoff minimums. Technically, they can take off in 0-0 conditions if they'd like to. That's not to say that would be a wise practice. It's generally a good idea not to take off unless you're reasonably sure you can get back down on the ground fairly quickly at either your departure airport or somewhere nearby if you have some sort of emergency. If you want to listen to a more detailed discussion on takeoff minimums for GA aircraft, make sure to check out the video on IFR departure procedures. The front half of FAR 91-175 talks about when you can descend below your decision height or your MDA on an instrument approach procedure. To be able to descend below your decision height or minimum descent altitude, you need three big things. One of three sets of lights, with two exceptions to that, and one of three parts of the runway, or one of three parts of the runway, and each of those three parts has three parts. First, the three big things are, number one, you need the aircraft to be continuously in a position from which a descent to landing on the intended runway may be made at a normal rate of descent using normal maneuvers. If you have to dive bomb the runway or perform an aerobatic maneuver to make it to the touchdown zone, you need to go around. Second, the flight visibility must not be less than the visibility prescribed on the approach. So you need at least the visibility for your category of aircraft on the approach plate for the approach you're shooting. But you'll notice it says flight visibility. So it's the visibility as determined from your vantage point in the air as the PIC, not necessarily the visibility reported on the ground. Third, you need to have at least one visual reference for the intended runway distinctly visible and identifiable to the pilot. These visual references are divided up into the three sets of lights we talked about earlier, and then the three different parts of the runway with their associated markings and lights. Let's look at the details. The first thing you might see that will allow you to descend below MDA or DH is the approach light system. Although you can use the approach lights to go below decision height or MDA, you can only descend to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation until you pick up something else. That's exception number one, unless, and here's exception number two, you have the red terminating bars or the red side row bars in sight. So basically remember that if you see the approach lights, you can descend down to 100 feet above the touchdown zone elevation, and if you see red in the approach lights, you can descend for a landing. There are only two approach light systems that have either red terminating bars or red side row bars. The ALSF-1 type system has the red terminating bars, and this approach lighting system is pretty rare. There are only a handful of them in the US, and they're more common at military fields than civilian airports. The ALSF-2 type system has the red side row bars, and these are a little more common. They're generally installed on any runway that has a Cat 2 or Cat 3 ILS approach. The other two sets of lights that you might see that would allow you to descend for a landing are the runway end identifier lights, or REALs, which are two white strobes on either side of the runway, or the visual glide slope indicators, so the VATSIM or the PAPI. So the three parts of the runway that you can visually identify to use to descend to a landing and their associated subparts are the runway threshold, plus the threshold markings and the threshold lights, the touchdown zone markings or the touchdown zone lights, the runway or the runway markings or the runway lights. Again, with the exception of the approach lights, you need only one of these visual cues to descend below your decision height or MDA for a landing. 91-175 has a few other miscellaneous rules, such as the reg that tells you that you need to execute your missed approach procedure if you've descended below the MDA or DH or are circling to land and subsequently lose visual contact with the field, in addition to if you arrive at decision height or the missed approach point and don't obtain visual contact. It states that radar vectors may be used in conjunction with approaches. You can be radar vectored onto any segment of the approach outside the final approach fix, but it's pretty typical for a pilot to get vectored somewhere between 3 and 5 miles from the final approach fix. When being radar vectored, a pilot should maintain the last assigned altitude until established on a published segment of the approach and cleared for the approach, and then can utilize the published altitudes on the approach. It also states that a procedure turn may not be flown on an approach segment that specifies no PT unless you're cleared to do the procedure turn by air traffic control. And it also states that you can substitute a DME, VOR, NDB, or RNAV/GPS fix for an outer marker on an ILS approach, which is part of the reason we have so few marker beacons left in the world. It also has a conversion table for RVR to statute miles visibility if the approach minimums are listed in RVR, but the RVR is not being reported if they're reporting the visibility in statute miles instead, which is pretty much everywhere in Flight Simulator. 91-177 governs minimum IFR altitudes and states that the minimum IFR altitude should be at least 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within 4 nautical miles of the route to be flown in non-mountainous areas, and 2,000 feet above the highest obstacle within 4 nautical miles of the route to be flown in mountainous areas. The easiest way to determine your minimum altitude is to use the MEA, MOCA, or AROCA on the low and route chart, depending on your route. And if you're wondering what the FAA considers mountainous versus non-mountainous, they have a map for that. 91-177 also states that if an MEA and MOCA are published on an airway, you can use the MOCA if you're navigating with VORs and within 22 miles of the VOR you're using. It also states that if you're on an airway segment where the MEA changes and goes higher, you don't need to start your climb until you reach the fix where the MEA changes, unless there's a minimum crossing altitude. So to give an example of this, if I'm navigating on Victor 534 headed to the northwest, you can see the MEA for the first segment here is 3,500 feet. Then we've got the little T's here that tell us the MEA changes, and it goes up to 4,500 feet. So if I want to stay at the MEA and continue to navigate with VORs along this stretch of the route, then I am going to want to start my climb from 3,500 to 4,500 at Bibbs intersection. I don't have to start that climb until I get to Bibbs. And we do have a minimum obstacle clearance altitude. So this altitude is okay to use. It will keep us clear of all obstacles, but we are only guaranteed VOR reception if we're within 22 nautical miles of the VOR. So once we get out here, about midway on this segment here, we can't use that MOCA and still receive the VORs. If we're using a GPS to navigate on this, that's just fine. We can use that 2,500 foot altitude. To show you an example of a minimum crossing altitude, if we're going on Victor 532 here, you can see when we get to this segment right here, the MEA is 3,700 feet, and then it becomes 5,500 feet over on the other side here, and then it has this little flag with an X. That's a minimum crossing altitude. It says instead of starting your climb from 37 to 55, when you get to GATSI, it's got a minimum crossing altitude, Victor 532. It's 4,800 going westbound, so we need to be at a minimum of 4,800 feet when we cross GATSI intersection. FAR 91-179 specifies IFR cruising altitudes. It basically says in the first part of the reg that your cruising altitude is whatever ATC assigns you in controlled airspace. So that does give them the freedom to assign, wrong direction for flight altitudes and odd altitudes that are not exactly an IFR altitude if they want to do so, or if you need to do so for operational reasons like icing. But generally speaking, they want you to maintain a VFR altitude if you're cleared to VFR on top, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. And then they expect you to file and fly a odd 1,000-foot altitude at or above the minimum IFR altitude if you're on a magnetic course of 0 degrees through 179 degrees, so basically eastbound, and to file and expect to fly an even 1,000-foot MSL altitude at or above the minimum IFR altitude if you're on a magnetic course of 180 around through 359, so basically westbound. Above 18,000 feet, your assigned altitudes and filed altitudes are going to be flight levels, which are pressure altitudes. You're going to set your altimeter to the standard setting of 2992. Because you're flying a pressure altitude instead of a barometrically adjusted indicated altitude, if the barometric pressure is low, some flight levels may not be usable because your aircraft would be below 18,000 feet and below Class A airspace at that altimeter setting. So if the altimeter is below a setting of 2992, then flight level 180 will not be usable. If it is below 2892, flight level 190 will not be available. And if it is below 2792, flight level 200 will not be usable. And again, the flight levels are 3 digits. They just drop off the latch 2 digits. So 180 is basically 18,000 feet pressure altitude, 190, 19,000 feet, 200 is 20,000 feet. While it's not uncommon to see an altimeter setting below 2992, it's pretty rare to see altimeter settings below 2892, and it's very rare to see altimeter settings below 2792. You only really see that in very major storms and hurricanes. So it would be unusual that anything other than flight level 180 is not available. I'll also mention that the airspace between flight level 290 and flight level 410 in the US and in many other countries is called Reduced Vertical Separation Minima Airspace, or RVSM airspace. It used to be that cruise altitudes in this airspace were separated by 2,000-foot increments instead of 1,000-foot increments. So your eastbound altitudes were flight level 290, flight level 330, and flight level 370. And then the westbound altitudes were 310, 350, and 390. And the even altitudes just weren't used. It was empty space to give the aircraft more separation up there. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, RVSM airspace was instituted, which allowed 1,000-foot altitude separation at those higher flight levels. So the eastbound cruise altitudes went to the standard odd altitudes of 290, 310, 330, and the westbound altitudes went to 300, 320, and 340 for appropriately equipped aircraft and authorized operators. There are some special equipment requirements for an aircraft to be able to operate in the RVSM airspace, at least in the US. You need two independent primary altitude measurement systems, which is altimeters. So you need two independent altimeters on the aircraft. You need one automatic altitude control system, that is an autopilot. One altitude alerting device, so something that will alert you if you deviate off your altitude by a certain amount, and then an altitude reporting transponder that can connect with the altitude measurement system. In the US, anytime you're above 10,000 feet, you also need ADS-B out. So that is required in RVSM airspace as well. Most of these systems have tolerances that they have to meet and inspections that they have to undergo, and authorization is required to operate in RVSM airspace. Your pilots need to be trained, your maintenance people need to be trained, and they want to make sure that your aircraft is up to snuff. I guess the requirements aren't quite as stringent as they used to be. It actually used to be that you would actually have to get a letter of authorization or something in your op specs from the FAA to be able to operate an RVSM. And now, as long as you meet the requirements of the special FAR, you're legal to operate up there, although the FAA, I guess, can ask for proof that you are in compliance with the regs to operate up there. The bottom line for Flight Simulator is you can generally assume that any aircraft that is certified to operate above flight level 290 is certified for RVSM, and you can safely operate it in there. And I don't think any of the virtual air traffic control services or anything like that are going to say no, you can't operate your airplane up there. Since we mentioned a VFR on top, let's talk a little bit about that. VFR on top is a kind of hybrid operation between IFR and VFR that you can use if you want to climb through a thin layer of clouds or other visibility obstructions, and then once you're on top, operate VFR. It allows you some of the flexibility of operating VFR while still allowing you to operate in weather that is less than that's prescribed for VFR flight. It's handy to use if your departure airport is IFR, but your arrival airport is VFR, and you expect to climb out of IFR conditions shortly after takeoff. To fly VFR on top, you can file an IFR flight plan and put VFR on top in the remarks of the flight plan, or you can just request a climb to an IFR climb to VFR on top clearance with your departure, with the clearance delivery at your departure airport. When you're flying VFR on top, you must comply with all the IFR regulations applicable to your flight. So you need to be instrument rated. Your aircraft needs to be instrument equipped. You have to adhere to a minimum IFR altitudes along the route, your IFR clearance, and your cleared route. You have to make appropriate position reports if required, and make appropriate radio communications. You have to comply with VFR visibility and distance from cloud criteria for the airspace that you're in once you are in the VFR on top conditions. And then you have to fly an appropriate VFR altitude once you're on top as well. You can change altitudes without getting the permission of the air traffic controller, but you should at least advise them before you do that. And then VFR on top is not permitted in Class A airspace. VFR on top should not be confused with VFR over the top. VFR on top is a hybrid IFR VFR clearance. It is actually an IFR operation. And then once you get on top, you can kind of operate like a VFR aircraft, and you can even cancel IFR. VFR over the top isn't really even an official operation. It's just a term that's used for operating VFR from takeoff through the cruise and descent and landing. It assumes that the departure and arrival airports are both VFR, but you may be flying over the top of IFR weather en route. So you're doing the entire operation VFR, and that is perfectly legal as long as you're in visual conditions. You don't necessarily have to see the ground as long as you can take off and land under VFR. It's not the wisest thing to do just because you're kind of taking away some options if you had an emergency en route and you needed to get down into one of those airports that's underneath the clouds if in the IFR area. But if you're instrument rated, it would be fine. You could easily get back down on an instrument approach, but it's not a great idea for a VFR only rated pilot. An example of an IFR, or excuse me, a VFR on top clearance is, let's say if I wanted to fly from Fort Smith Airport, maybe up to Northwest Arkansas or out to the Little Rock area, I could file an IFR flight plan from Fort Smith to Fort Smith VOR, and we'll say that we've got a low ceiling, maybe it's 500 feet at Fort Smith, something like that, but the top reports are 3,000 feet, you will be in the clear. And then it's all VFR once you get past, say, Russellville or something like that. So we file that flight plan, we call up clearance in Fort Smith, they call back and they say, Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel cleared to Fort Smith Vortex, since that's what we filed to, and not to an airport, via radar vectors, then is filed. Climb to and report reaching VFR on top. If not on top by 5,000, maintain 5,000 and advise. They give us the regular departure frequency and the squawk code, just like if we are operating a VFR flight. And then what we do is we take off, we head to Fort Smith VOR. Once we get on top of the cloud layer, that we tell them, we are VFR on top. At that point, we can change our altitudes as long as we advise them. And just proceed to Little Rock VFR, and we can even cancel our IFR flight plan if we'd like to do that. If we don't get to VFR conditions on top, if we're still in the clouds when we get to 5,000, then we need to call them back and let them know what we want to do. Do we want to try to get up to maybe 7,500 feet and see if the tops are a little higher? Do we want to come back and make an instrument approach into Fort Smith? We just need to let them know what we'd like to do at that point. FAR 91-185 governs when you have to make position reports under IFR to ATC in real life. This is pretty rare in today's mostly radar environment, but there are still a few places that you have to do this. You're only required to make position reports over compulsory reporting points. These are these solid symbols on the sectional chart. They can be intersections, they can be nav aids, they can be GPS waypoints. Anything that's solid instead of the hollow symbol is a compulsory reporting point, and you do need to make a mandatory position report to ATC when you pass over those, unless you're told you don't have to. And then you have to make a position report when you're entering or leaving a hold, and then when requested to do so by ATC. You can remember what you need to say when you make a position report by using the acronym PATTONS. At all fixes, radar and contact or no, you need to state your position, state your altitude, and state the time you are flying over that fix. If you are not in radar contact, you also have to provide your estimated time arrival over your next fix, the name of your next fix, and any supplemental information or anything related to safety of flight. This would include things like unforecasted weather that you've encountered or just anything else related to the safety of flight. FAR 91-185 deals with what you should do if you lose radio communications in flight under IFR conditions. It states that if you are operating under an IFR flight plan, but you are in VFR conditions or you encounter VFR conditions after you depart, then you should continue the flight under VFR and land as soon as practical. If the failure occurs in IFR conditions, then it says the pilot shall continue the flight, and the route that you want to use is one of the four following routes, and the way we remember these is Avenue F. You want to follow AVEF, Avenue F. You want to follow the assigned route, the route assigned in the last ATC clearance. If you are being radar vectored, V is the vector. So if you are being radar vectored by the direct route from the point that the radio failed to the fix or route or airway that they specified in the vector clearance, whatever they were vectoring you to. In absence of an assigned route or a vector being provided, then you want to fly by the route that ATC had advised you to expect in a further clearance. And in the absence of any of those three, then you want to just fly what you filed in your flight plan. As far as the altitude that you want to fly, you have three options, and you want to pick the highest of these three. And the way we remember this is that we want to fly above our MEA, or fly at our MEA. And the MEA stands for M, minimum IFR altitude, so that would be the actual MEA on our route or the off-route obstruction clearance altitude if we're doing like a GPS direct route. The expected altitude, so the altitude or flight level ATC had advised you to expect in a further clearance. For instance, if they cleared you initially on the ground to climb and maintain 3,000, expect 9,000 in 10 minutes. Then roughly 10 minutes after you depart, go ahead and depart 3,000 and climb on up to 9,000. And then the last is assigned, the last altitude assigned in the last ATC clearance. So whichever of those three altitudes is higher, that's the altitude you want to maintain. In reality, in talking with several real-life controllers, they say if that an aircraft really does lose radio contact, what they're going to do is try to just move everybody out of their way. But it is helpful for them if they have some idea of what they think you're going to do. Also, don't forget, if you have lost radio contact, put in 7600 in your transponder, and hopefully that will let them know that you have lost your radios. So the final rule that we'll look at is 91-187, and it says that you shall report as soon as practical to ATC any malfunctions of navigation, approach, or communication equipment that occurs in flight. It states that when you make that report, it's going to include your aircraft ID, the equipment that's affected, the degree to which the capability of the pilot to operate under IFR in the ATC system is impaired, and the nature and extent of the assistance desired from ATC, if any. Some people do consider this a bit of an outdated rule. Obviously, if you have a major malfunction that impairs your ability to navigate or communicate or to fly certain types of arrival approach procedures or anything like that, you do need to report that to ATC. But this rule, if you follow it to the letter of the law, requires you to report things like the failure of an ADF that you might not even be using. So if you have something like that happen, you should report it to ATC to follow the rules. But sometimes ATC will ask what assistance you need, and you tell them, well, I don't need any. I'm not using that. And they may act a little annoyed. Some will even ask you, well, why did you tell me? So if that happens, just tell them, well, I know, I'm not going to use it, and it's kind of ridiculous to tell you, but FAR 91 187 requires that I do that. The rest of the IFR regs in Part 91 have to do with Cat 2 and 3 ILS approaches, so we'll talk more about those when we actually get into aircraft that are capable of flying those. So that concludes this video. Hopefully it's giving you the knowledge and skills that you need to understand the regulations that pertain to IFR flying so that you can make your instrument flying in Flight Simulator more realistic, get us ready to do our IFR cross-country flying, and maybe even inspire you to tackle some virtual ATC flying. Again, if you've enjoyed the content, don't forget to like the video, share with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.